A fedora? What does it mean to you? For me personally, it's always meant sophistication, danger, and a little bit of mystery. In this case, however, the definition is flipped on its head because behind that hat is hiding one of the most sinister groups in the 1930s, the Mafia. This story will be told through quotes from various sources that have studied the Mafia, as well as from the men themselves. So let's talk about Mafia. Fear wears a fedora. As we all know, a fedora is a hat that has a soft brim all the way around, unlike a typical gangster cap, which is stiff in the front. They were popular with both upper and lower class citizens because they could be dressed up or down. The main reason for their popularity, however, was because they were cheap, durable, and fashionable. This is precisely why the Mafia loved them so much. They were seen as a symbol of wealth and power by the general public, but cost very little compared to other hats. In Chapter 8 of his book, The Mafia, American Organized Crime Syndicates, author and journalist David Critchley talks about how dressing up in nice clothes was a big part of the mobster lifestyle. He says for the gangsters, it was an outward manifestation of their newfound wealth and power, a sign of success, and a means of attracting the admiration of others. It didn't matter if you were a bootlegger, a gambler, or a killer, you would still dress in your Sunday best when leaving the house. At least that's what the public saw when talking about mobsters dressing to impress. This quote from Carlo Gambino's son Carl Jr. really stands out. He says if you wanted to be somebody in the Mafia, you had to dress like a gentleman. No matter what you did, whether you gambled, sold drugs, or whatever, you couldn't look like a bum doing it. You had to look respectable. Not only was dressing in expensive clothing a way for mafiosos to show off, but it also helped to hide their crimes. Because they looked like businessmen, shop owners, doctors, lawyers, and so on, people never suspected them of being involved in illegal activities. This is the perfect segue into the topic of today's video. Since the outfit that mobsters wore with their fedoras were almost always dark-colored suits, fedoras in the same color family became a common accessory. In the photo, we see 4 men wearing black suits and black fedoras. This picture was taken outside of a Brooklyn social club where mobsters often gathered to play cards and shoot the breeze. Author Nicholas Pileggi talks about these clubs in great detail in his book, The Good Life. He explains how they were important because they provided a place where mobsters could meet up with other mafiosos and potential recruits. He says, there were all kinds of social clubs, but the really important ones were the ones where the Mafia guys hung out. These were places where you knew there were Mafia guys around, and that was important because if you were a Mafia guy, you'd like to know that there were other Mafia guys around too. Another reason why mobsters preferred dark-colored clothing was because they blended in with the shadows. Most of their activities took place during the night. And when you're sneaking around in the shadows, you don't want to attract any attention. This is even true for the biggest mob bosses. For example, Charles Lucky Luciano. Lucky was a man who valued discretion. He understood that being flashy and drawing attention was a good way to get whacked. Although he wasn't the most powerful boss in the world, he was definitely one of the most influential. And he knew how to keep his head down and stay out of the limelight. One of the rare times he agreed to be photographed was at his daughter's wedding. He's in the second row, right behind her and her new husband. If you look closely, you can see that he's wearing a black suit and a black fedora. But the Mafia weren't the only ones wearing fedoras. During the Great Depression, a lot of men wore them because they were cheap. Some of the most famous Hollywood leading men of the era donned the iconic hat. Gary Cooper, Humphrey Bogart, and Edward G. Robinson, for example, were regularly seen wearing fedoras in movies. But it wasn't just the actors. Directors and producers were wearing them too. In fact, most men in the film industry sported a fedora. And it wasn't just America where fedoras were popular. In Italy, it was considered the height of fashion for men. In the early 20th century, the Italian Mafia imported the style from America and adapted it to their own culture. This trend eventually spread throughout Europe and Asia. The Japanese especially took to the style and became known for their high-quality fedora hats. The reason why fedoras became so popular in Japan is because they were seen as a symbol of Western culture, which was considered to be more advanced than their own. This is even reflected in the Yakuza, the Japanese Mafia. Many members wear fedoras as part of their traditional dress. With that said, it seems as though everyone was wearing fedoras during the 1930s. Politicians, gangsters, and everyday working men. But here's the thing. Not every mobster wore a fedora. The choice of headwear depended on the region and the time of year. For example, in New England, mobsters tended to wear baseball caps instead of fedoras. On the other hand, in the southern United States, mobsters favored straw hats over both fedoras and baseball caps. But no matter what type of hat they wore, there was one thing that remained constant, and that was the color. In his book, The Atlantic Monthly author and historian T.J. English talks about how mobsters preferred darker colors. He says the Mafia code of silence was absolute, and if a man was going to break that silence, it had to be on his own terms. It was a dangerous business and a lonely one. The Mafia was a secret society, after all, and its members were expected to keep it that way. Although this quote isn't directly related to headwear, it gives us some insight into the mentality of mobsters and why they preferred darker colors. Black, gray, and brown were the most common colors because they reminded people of the darkness and shadows that mobsters operated in. It also helped them to blend in with the crowd. Speaking of blending in, there was one particular group of mobsters that took this to the next level: the Jewish gangsters of the 1930s. Unlike their Italian counterparts, Jewish gangsters didn't necessarily dress in dark colors. They knew that standing out was a good way to make money. This is because the goods that they smuggled and sold were often brightly colored. In fact, most of the illegal merchandise coming out of the five families during this time period was red. Think about it. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the words Mafia and 1930s? If you said red, then you're correct. Red was the color of blood and violence, two things that the Mafia had plenty of during this time period. The reason why the color red became so popular was because of the rise of bootlegging. During the Prohibition era, it was a highly lucrative business. And since most bootleggers sold their liquor in large quantities, the crates and boxes that they used were almost always painted red. Not only was it a good way to stand out, but it also made it easier to identify the cargo. If a cop ever asked what was inside a red box, the answer was always the same: tomatoes. So you might be thinking to yourself, when did wearing a fedora become unfashionable? The answer is complicated and depends on who you ask. Some say it was the end of World War II, while others argue that it was the advent of rock and roll music in the 1950s. Whatever the case may be, it's safe to say that fedoras went out of style once men stopped dressing up for everyday occasions. They were seen as outdated and stuffy. This is why very few people wear them today. When it comes to mobsters, however, they still occasionally sport a fedora. After all, it's a timeless piece of headwear that will never go out of style. If you want to learn more about the Mafia, check out the playlists in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.